And then I'm going to introduce our speaker today. So we have Dr. Seminoff. He is the leader of the Marine Turtle Ecology and Assessment Program at the National Marine Fisheries Service, the Southwest Fisheries Science Center. And then since 1992, Jeff has been involved in ecology research and conservation of sea turtles in the Pacific Ocean. He is the past president of the International Sea Turtle Society and hosted the 31st International Symposium on Sea Turtle Biology and Conservation in San Diego. So we are super lucky to have him. Jeff has authored over 200 peer-reviewed publications, and his research has been featured on the Discovery Channel, Animal Planet, PBS, and National Geographic. So maybe one of our most decorated speakers we've had so far. So we're super excited to have you. I'm gonna go ahead and stop my video, and then Jeff, you can go ahead and start sharing your screen and we will get this party started.
Let's rock and roll. Let's share. Good morning, everybody. Let me get that going.
Perfect.
Total pleasure to be here today. I want to thank Carly and Elke and the Humane Society for the opportunity to speak with everybody today. It's definitely a unique time in our country and on this planet, and so I take great pride in being able to kind of help us forget about what's happening outside our doors and maybe talk a little bit about turtles. And for those of you that may have read the sort of little blurb about this talk initially, I led that blurb with the fact that sea turtle presence in California, and particularly in San Diego, is probably one of the best kept wildlife secrets. And for the last 18 years, so as Carly mentioned, I'm with the National Marine Fisheries Service at our Southwestern Fisheries Science Center in La Jolla, California, just up the hill from the Scripps campus. And I've been there for the last 18 years, going on 19 years. And during that time, we've done a lot of sea turtle work. And I'm going to share some stories today about the research and the conservation that we've done at our lab here in San Diego and throughout California. But I'm also going to talk broadly just about sea turtle biology and conservation to give people kind of a sense of just how majestic and amazing these animals are, and really how resilient they've been in the onslaught of just human impacts for the last several hundred years. So let's see here. So a little bit different title than what was advertised. It's Biology and Conservation of Sea Turtles with an emphasis on California's turtles. And I changed it a little bit because I wanted to add a bit more about just the background of turtles in general to give us all more of an appreciation of just how amazing these creatures are. And so to start with, let's just go back 100 million years or so ago. And this is Archelone. This is one of the dinosaur turtles. And it's just amazing how even in present day, the shell structure, the morphology of these animals, granted much smaller than Archelone was 100 million-ish years ago, but they're basically living dinosaurs and look very similar to what they did in the past. And one of the things that I love to think about when I look at turtles is something called functional morphology. And that is that the shape of an animal, its morphology, is strongly linked to kind of how it makes a living, its life history. And just to give you an example with sort of four sort of emblematic species here, loggerheads, hawksbills on the lower left are leatherbacks, then green turtles, is if you just look at the shape of their head, you can tell a lot about their life history. You can tell about what they eat, what their sort of just whole daily lives are like. And for example, with the loggerhead turtle, they have this giant skull. It's used to crush the mollusks and hard-bodied prey species that they eat. So they need that large head to support that musculature that allows them to crush their prey. The hawksbill turtle, much like its namesake, has this almost hawksbill-like beak. They're spongivores. They eat nothing but sponges. And granted, they're not too common in California, although we have had 2 observations of hawksbills in the last several years in our waters. Leatherback turtles, they have this large sort of on their upper jaw, this big notch, hook-like thing that helps them capture their prey, which are they eat gelatinous plankton, jellyfish, pyrosomes, things like that. And then finally, green turtles. You look at that beak, it's just this almost like scissors, that upper and lower jaw just connect with each other with virtually no space in between them. And it acts like a pair of scissors. So as they're cruising along the seafloor and eating their algae and seagrass, they can really crop that really close to the floor and just be more efficient consumers. But let's go back further. let's think about times, prehistoric times, and it's quite clear that sea turtles were once among the most larger vertebrates in our world's oceans. And so their sheer biomass in marine habitats like this or on nesting beaches were things that were just awe-inspiring, just to see so many animals. And granted, maybe we don't have the same abundance in some cases these days, but there are some really fantastic success stories of sea turtles, and I'll talk about some of those today, about how populations have recovered through time. But when we think about these large just aggregations of turtles, another thing to point out is sort of their ecological role. And one of the things that is especially important for sea turtles with their sheer abundance is that they are sort of the transporters of marine nutrient subsidies into coastal terrestrial ecosystems. So for example, this is a nesting beach for olive ridley turtles in Costa Rica. Olive ridleys, which is a species that occurs way offshore in the Central Pacific, but not necessarily that frequently in California waters. But nonetheless, it's a species that has this mass nesting behavior. They're called arabatas. The animals come to shore, and to give you an example, in Mexico, which is where the largest arabata beach is, a place called Escobilla. A couple years ago, one of these arabatas lasted for 5 days and had about 400,000 turtles. So they're all coming to shore. Each individual is laying about 10 pounds of eggs, each of these females. Certainly all those eggs don't hatch. A lot of terrestrial predators come from the beach back, from the vegetation. They eat those eggs. They bring that nutrition back into the terrestrial system. And so that marine subsidy is something that is featured really prominently in terms of the importance of the ecological role of sea turtles around the world. If we focus in marine habitats, another example is that we consider sea turtles to be these sort of ecosystem engineers or these ecosystem regulators. That is, by their sheer number and their consumption of, in this case, a green turtle eating seagrass, they actually shape what that coastal ecosystem looks like. And to take it a step further with green turtles, if there were no green turtles, and this is something that present day, there's more and more places where we are seeing recoveries of turtles, and they are starting to fulfill their ecological role. But the green turtle eats seagrass. It consumes that, it digests it, it poops out the nutrients, the phosphorus, the nitrates, carbon, nitrogen back into the water column. And by them consuming that seagrass and digesting it, it mobilizes those nutrients much more rapidly than if that seagrass just sat there and grew and died slowly over the course of months or years. So these sea turtles sort of act like a spark plug for nutrient flow in these coastal ecosystems, in addition to that nutrient subsidy that I just talked about. And there's no surprise that sea turtles have been spiritually important for many cultures worldwide. This is an indigenous group called the Comcac in northwestern Sonora, Mexico, in the Gulf of California, where they believe that their ancestors are leatherback turtles, which is pictured here. And whereas in previous generations, they would consume green turtles, they never ate leatherbacks. They'd bring them to shore, they'd adorn them with natural pigments and paints, they'd have a festival for 4 days and release those animals back into the water. So these are sorts of these ritualistic interactions with turtles that happen in many, many prehistoric and contemporary cultures worldwide. And then if we just think about sort of modern days, I mean, I personally, and probably those of us on the call or on the video today, we cherish sea turtles. It's sort of that Discovery Channel impact. You know, we think of them, they kind of are emblematic of the resilience of natural wildlife to human impacts. They also sort of are an example of how wildlife has suffered at the hands of humans. I'll share some of those stories today too. And the big problem has been overexploitation. And turtles have been cherished as a food supply, in addition to the spiritual component, a food supply for human populations around the world. And whereas in the past that was something that was extremely prevalent that resulted in incredibly unsustainable harvest, like this photo. This is an olive ridley dump very near to that Arabata beach that I talked about in southern Mexico, and where they would just extract these animals by the thousands, and populations in the 60s, 70s, 80s absolutely crashed. And so starting, let's say, in the early 90s, there was just incredible effort to start to try and recover these populations. Initially, nesting beach sea turtle conservation started on nesting beaches. So that was sort of an easy point source. we knew turtles would come out of the water in certain spots. There'd be impacts in those areas, so we would protect those beaches. Makes a lot of sense. And even today, nesting beach conservation is one of the primary activities of people that are working to save sea turtle populations around the world. But probably, I would say in sort of the early 90s, a lot more emphasis was started to be placed on in-water populations, so protecting marine habitats, trying to understand movements and migration and habitat use. Again, if we understand like where these animals are and what habitats they depend on, we are better equipped to protect those areas and help recover sea turtle populations. This is a loggerhead turtle equipped with a satellite tag, that little apparatus on its shell there, released just offshore San Diego a few years ago. So next part of the talk, I'm going to get into just a little bit about the just generalized life history of sea turtles. And let's start with the fact that there are 7 species worldwide. 4 of those occur in California waters. So leatherbacks, which I'll talk about later, that flatback turtle, upper middle, that's a species that's endemic to Australian waters. It only occurs in Australia. Loggerheads, we'll talk about. Hawksbills, I mentioned, they're very infrequently, 2 animals only ever seen in California, so it's more of a tropical species. Olive ridleys, they occur offshore, not so much in California, but once we get, say, a couple hundred miles offshore, they become more prevalent. And then they have a sister species called the Kemp's ridley, which occurs in the Gulf of Mexico and that's up the eastern seaboard of the United States, which is a population that was extremely endangered, but through conservation success, it's really recovered tremendously. And then finally, sort of my favorite, it's our local hero, it's the green turtle in the eastern Pacific. So the portion of the Pacific Ocean from the coast of the Americas down to through Central America to the coast of Chile. We have a species called the Eastern Pacific green turtle. I should say subspecies. And it's we also refer to it as black turtle. And so that's the morph of the green turtle that occurs in California waters. So I'm going to share 3 stories today with 3 different species. And with those, I'm going to touch on sort of nesting biology. So when they come to the beach, what's it like when they nest? The in-water biology and ecology. Their population status, so how many are there and what's the population trends? And then finally, sort of local research and conservation. So what have we been doing to collect biological data on these animals, and what have the royal we, in a larger context, what have people been doing to try and protect these species in California waters? This is sort of a generalized life history diagram of sea turtles, which is a little bit dizzying. So let me just break it down for us. And regardless of the species, this life history cycle is more or less the same across species. And I'll use the green turtle again as an example. And so females congregate offshore at the beginning of a nesting season. Again, all turtles, they're coming out of the water to nest, to deposit their eggs. A female will move up onto the beach. She'll dig a large egg chamber, deposit eggs. A green turtle will lay about 100 eggs, but that can vary. Like the leatherback, the giant leatherback turtle will lay roughly 60 eggs, whereas a hawksbill turtle can lay up to 200 eggs within one nest. They're a little bit bigger than a ping pong ball, a little bit smaller than a racquetball, sort of leathery to the touch. So not like a chicken egg, they're actually a little bit soft. And the reason for that is as they are developing, they take in water from the ambient incubation environment. So they actually gain weight and they expand a little bit as they develop and as that developing embryo grows inside the egg. After about 45-ish days, depending on the species, the hatchlings emerged from those nests at night. They scurry down the beach to hit the water. At this point, there's just an onslaught of predators, whether it be seabirds or crabs or fish or raccoons or what have you. And the sort of rule of thumb is that of 1,000 hatchlings, maybe 1 will make it to adulthood. So it's a very low survivorship at that young age, but still, you know, they're flooding the beaches with literally thousands of hatchlings in hope that a few will survive. So once those animals head offshore, this is a small green turtle, they start to associate with floating mats of seaweed and sort of floats them and jets them offshore. They eat invertebrates like the ctenophore pictured here. They're just sort of omnivorous and eat whatever they can get their mouth on. After about, 2 to 4 years of living in the high seas and passively drifting around with these floating islands of seaweed, which effectively act like a little bit of protection. It's like their little micro ecosystem that they stay with. After about 2 to 4 years, perhaps a little bit longer, then they move back into coastal waters. And this is what we call an ontogenetic habitat shift. So based on their life history stage, as they transition from small juveniles to larger juvenile stage, their habitat preferences change. And that's when they come into coastal habits like pictured here. This is one of our turtles in Jolla Cove, just down the hill from my lab, actually. So those that don't know, we have several thriving populations of sea turtles in San Diego County, and one of them is just right down the street from us. So in terms of exploitation and threats, one of the biggest ones historically has been the collection of eggs. And it's illegal in most places, not every place. But even if it wasn't illegal, there's kind of two ends of the spectrum. And this is something that everybody will have their own opinion on in terms of like, is it justified or not? But at the one end of the spectrum, we have, this gentleman, this is down in Oaxaca, a photo I took many years ago that was collecting eggs for his family, one nest. His kids were out of the frame here, but his kids and wife were right here, and they were very excited to have this food. On the other end of the spectrum, and this is one of several photos that a number of years ago went viral. This is from Ostional in Costa Rica, where there's a legalized egg harvest, where this is total industrial exploitation, taking every egg off the beach early in the nesting season. And there's some justification for it biologically, which I don't have the time to get into today, but nonetheless, it doesn't pass the sniff test. There's something a little bit wrong with such an incredible industrial exploitation of eggs like that. And again, we all kind of fall out in different perspectives on this, but I am one where I definitely I'm sympathetic to the guy on the left, not so much to the horseback egg extraction on the right. And then to compound that, and what has really precipitated out incredible declines, particularly with leatherback turtles, as with this image here, that's a leatherback turtle, is bycatch and marine fisheries. So whether it's shrimp trawlers that drag the seafloor to collect their shrimp, 1 pound of shrimp and 99 pounds of bycatch and turtles and things like that that get discarded, or whether it's long lines or drift nets, these sort of fishing techniques have had just disastrous impacts on turtles. And this is worldwide, and this is not any one particular area's issue, it's humankind, really. The more we depend on marine resources, the more threatened and endangered species like marine mammals and sea turtles are impacted. And there have been some incredible success stories to minimize these impacts, and I'll feature a couple of those stories later on. But nonetheless, fisheries bycatch continues to be just a huge problem for turtle survival. So then there's like this existential problem too of like our planet and this planet on fire, and regardless of what people feel, the data do indicate that the planet is warming at an alarming rate, something that's much more rapid than any other time in prehistory, any other natural changes. The planet is warming quickly. And here's just an example of the temperature anomalies, how in the last 30 years, temperatures, if we look at the right of that graph, these are anomalies, so not actual temperatures, but degrees above or below normal. And so we can see that the planet is heated tremendously. One thing that I didn't mention about sea turtles, and this is where the problem comes in, is that like most turtles, not all turtles, but like most turtles, all sea turtles have what's called temperature sex determination. They do not have sex chromosomes, so they don't have an X and Y chromosome. What they have is all X chromosomes, and depending on the temperature of incubation, that influences what gender that hatchling comes out as. The critical, what we call pivotal temperature, is about 28.5 to 29 degrees Celsius. And whatever the temperature is of that incubating embryo, at about a third of the way through that incubation, on a day about 20 of incubation, that will trigger whether or not that individual becomes a male or a female. And so when you consider global climate change and warming, and things get warmer, you can kind of see the potential problem we have here. And that, if we look at this increasing temperature just a couple degrees, and I failed to mention that the warmer temperatures produce females. Anything above 28.5, 29 will be a female, anything below is a male. Well, as our planet heats, we're going to have all females. And, in the human population, I'm sympathetic to the situation for humans, but for turtles, all females is not going to work. And this is a problem we call it global feminization of sea turtles. And indeed, we have places like the Great Barrier Reef where little by little we're starting to see different populations that are starting to decline, not because of impacts, but because there's not enough males. There's not enough males there to inseminate females and allow them to come up and nest. And so this is a problem that's creeping up in different places. We're starting to see what we call female biases, so way more females in a population than males around the world. And in San Diego Bay, for example, for every, let's say, 50 turtles we catch, about 6 or 7 of them are males. All the rest are females. And 6 or 7 is enough to probably fertilize females and keep the population going, but how much longer before it's 1 male or no males? And then we're in a real dire straits. So the other example I want to talk about, and then I'll get to sort of some fun stories in a second. Sorry to stay with some of the negativity here to begin with, but it's the reality I deal with at my job. But sea level rise is a big issue. It's no surprise that as temperatures rise, the poles are losing their ice mass. It's resulting in sea level rise. We hear about it on the news. It's more of like what you read, but you don't see real examples of it, so it might not really hit home. But I have an example here to show how it really hits home. And so green turtles, let's move to the Central Pacific, to off the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. So East Island, so in that lower map you can kind of see a arrow there pointing to that spot within the French frigate shoal island chain. May 2018, and this is one of the most important green turtle nesting beaches in the Central Pacific Ocean, in the Hawaiian Islands. There was in the late summer of 2018, there was a hurricane, or let's say a storm, and they're accustomed to storms. These are periodic events that happen all the time, but storms are getting more intense, sea levels are rising, and that's East Island today. It's essentially gone. From that one storm. And in years past with lower sea levels, this was not a problem, but you can see like a sand island like this has just disappeared. And that's, hopefully that doesn't continue at other spots in the Central Pacific or elsewhere. So let's focus on California. And we're gonna talk about sea turtles in the California current large marine ecosystem. I think many of us know that our coastal waters are incredibly productive. There's nutrient upwelling that happens in the late summer and fall months each year that bring nutrient-rich waters up to the surface. It just is a spark plug for local productivity. Turtles from around the Pacific come to California waters to forage on the abundant jellies if you're a jellyfish, or pardon me, if you're a leatherback, or seagrass and marine algae if you're a green turtle. Now, California, we talked about the impacts of marine fisheries a moment ago, and it's safe to say that if you are a sea turtle, the waters of California are probably one of the safest places on the planet to live. And I'll give you 2 examples of that. And the first, and as many of us may know, is that we depend on the California-based marine fisheries, like for swordfish or tuna or Dungeness crab and things like that. Those are all just incredibly important economic resources for us. But at the same time, when we're fishing for those things, we impact and oftentimes kill endangered species like sea turtles. And so starting in about 2000, the state of California, and rather the entire US West Coast, started to develop what are called time area closures. And the first one of these closures, this red polygon here, which is from California up through northern Oregon, it's called the Pacific Leatherback Conservation Area. And this, mind you, is pretty much one of the most productive areas for swordfish fishing in the entire Eastern Pacific Ocean. However, and during the time when fishing is most productive, when that upwelling is happening most frequently, most prevalently, that area is closed to fishing. So 15 of August to 15 November, every single year, that area is closed to swordfish fishing. And that is because that is the time of the year that leatherbacks are coming from distant waters of the Western Pacific into our coastal waters to forage. That's what we call that static closure. It's the same every year. And then there's another area called the Loggerhead closure area that through our work, we learned that during warm water periods, like El Nino periods, loggerheads started to show up in California waters. And they would get interacted with those swordfish fisheries just like what happened up north. And so our agency, NOAA, developed what's called a time area closure here but it's a dynamic closure, meaning that it doesn't happen every year. It's not like clockwork like that red polygon up above, but instead it gets triggered during these warm water El Nino periods. So the last time it was closed was in 2015 to fishing, and any future warm water period, that area will be closed to fishing again. So those are great sort of examples of how we are working to kind of minimize human impacts to turtles. So let's talk about, I'm going to just now go through into the next portion of the talk. I'm going to give sort of the last portion of the talk. I'll give 3 examples of the 3 different species that occur in the area. So leatherbacks to start with. So they visit our waters of Central California during late summer and fall periods. Monterey Bay and up through the Gulf of Farallon and Farallon Islands are areas that leatherbacks are particularly prevalent. As I said earlier, they eat gelatinous prey, so like that sea nettle, which is the Chrysaorus species on the top, something called an egg yolk jelly in the middle there on the left, and on the bottom a moon jelly. Those are all like favorite prey of leatherback turtles. You know, and I'll just say, like, they're such cool animals, and like they're like mini-me's. You look at that leatherback, this is a hatchling. They're about 6 ounces. They fit in the palm of your hand. They almost look like mini replicas of the adults. And another thing with leatherbacks to point out is, you know, the massive size of those flippers. So I said earlier that hatchling turtles get offshore, associate with those rafts of seagrass or marine algae or just garbage, and it's sort of their private Idaho, the area that they hang out in for a number of years. That's because those hard-shell turtles, like green turtles and loggerheads, they have very small flippers. They can't really dive. They're floaters for the early portion of their life. Leatherbacks are totally different. They hit the water as little hatchlings, and they are ready to go. They have these huge flippers. They can dive to 30 meters. They can forage and do all these things that the hard-shelled turtles can't. So there's sort of like a mini club in the sea turtle world of people that just fancy leatherbacks more than any other species, and for good reason. I mentioned that the functional morphology, looking at the shape of their beak in this case, you can tell what they eat. They also have these things, these called papillae in their throat on the lower right there. You know, little sort of nodules, arrow-shaped things. So when they're eating these jellies and they're swallowing it, it can't escape. It's a one-way valve. Food only goes down and does not come out. So here's just this is a bloom of moon jellies near the Farallon Islands. And these, it's almost like you can walk on water on top of these jellies, just they're so abundant. And this is really the reason why leatherbacks come from far away to forage in our California waters. So in terms of research, what we do, we use boats to capture animals. We use planes to do aerial surveys to figure out where these turtles are. One of the most important things in terms of minimizing impacts is first understanding where the turtles occur. And so since 2000, we've been on an almost annual basis conducting aerial surveys off the Central California coast. This gives you an example of where we have spotted leatherback turtles. You can see kind of close to the coast these horizontal grayish color lines sort of interspersed among the colored dots. And those are the transect lines. Those are the lines that the aircraft flies as we look for turtles. And we fly low, about 500 feet, and slow at about 100 knots. And these aircraft have belly windows and bubble windows on the side, so we can just see these animals quite clearly. And they're 6 to 7 feet long, so you can really see an animal, especially when it's a calm day. We use those aircraft also to guide in our capture boat. My colleague, Scott Benson, leads our leatherback work. He's at the front of the boat with that large hoop net, and you can see the leatherback turtle there. That aircraft plane, it sort of peeled away from its normal line transect work and became a spotter plane and helped us get on top of this turtle through radioing with the boat, and we get this. And once we get those animals, we bring them on board. Here's a leatherback. This one was about a little over 1,200 pounds, close to 1,300 pounds back in September 2007, but we still do this work. We'll hopefully, COVID willing, we'll be on the water this September and October to do more of this work. But some of the reasons we're catching these animals, aside from doing a health assessment and understanding the health of individuals, is we want to understand their location, as I talked about, but also what do they eat, what's their habitat use. So we use a number of different techniques. One of them is a camera where we will put it on the back of the turtle. It requires we do not catch the animal, we just get close to it, use a suction cup tag to put it on. So I'll give you just a kind of a little primer of sort of what this video looks like. So this is a leatherback turtle. That red spot on its head, that's called a pineal spot. It's just a normal pigment on there, often used as a fingerprint to identify individuals. This turtle is foraging on sea nettles, the chrysora. They usually come up from underneath the animals and eat all the gonads and the oral arms, everything inside, all that's like high nutrient portions, and they'll leave that bell, that top part alone. Oftentimes we'll be out trying to catch turtles and we'll see a whole pool of jellies with all the oral arms and everything missing. It's just like, oh my gosh, a leatherback has been here, it's been feeding, and we see just sort of the scraps of that animal. So just sort of using these technologies, we can tell a lot about the biology of these turtles. And then secondly, we'll do satellite telemetry. We put tags on the top of these animals to track their movements. It communicates to satellites and sends the daily positions of that turtle back to us. It would be hard to track this turtle from a boat as it's crossing the Pacific, but with the satellite tag, we have great success doing that. This gives a little bit of an idea. It's roughly 240 satellite tags that have been deployed over the last 20-ish years or so. And it shows in the Pacific, there's actually what we call two different stocks of animals. And let's see if my cursor's on here. So here's California, and perhaps you can't see the cursor, but I'm just going to assume we can for a second. Here's the animals that were tagged in California, the dark green. Those animals kind of swam across the Pacific to their nesting beaches. And we've also worked here in the Western Pacific in a place called the Bird's Head region of Papua, Indonesia. And that's the primary stronghold for nesting for leatherbacks in the Western Pacific. It's also the primary origin of turtles that come to California. So this is about 12,000 kilometers that these animals swim to access waters of California. It's got to be pretty productive here to warrant that energy investment to swim across the Pacific, and indeed it is. And California is probably one of the most important foraging areas for leatherbacks that nest in the Western Pacific. But there's also this other stock, which we call the Eastern Pacific stock, which totally does not overlap with our turtles, which is strange because you'd think like they're off the tip of Baja. It's as close to California as any place else on this map. And yet those turtles are not coming to California. They all go south. And with both of these populations, they have been tremendously impacted by egg exploitation, as I talked about earlier, but more recently it's been the bycatch and marine fisheries has been incredibly problematic. And we're working to change those impacts right now. So this gives an idea of just the population trends. It's a grim story. The Western Pacific animals that are coming to California, they're declining right now at about 6% a year. So it's sort of this slow exponential decay. And the animals in the Eastern Pacific, they're declining even more rapidly. And you know, this of any species of sea turtle worldwide, and despite the success stories that I'll talk about, and I've alluded to, leatherbacks are the one species that have been so incredibly impacted that some nesting populations in our lifetime may very well go extinct. So it's a sort of a sobering remark about the reality of what we're dealing with. So in California, one of the things that has been a little bit of a problem, but we've had some great solutions recently, has been not the swordfish fishery, because we have that time area closure that's addressed that, but starting in 2014 with that, what we call marine heat wave, it just changed the behavior of whales and leatherbacks, and they started to occur in areas where they hadn't occurred before. And that's when the Dungeness crab fishery became very problematic. Dungeness crab are collected with these, it's a pot fishery, so it's a cage that's set to the sea floor with a line on it. Things like humpback whales, and particularly in 2014, 2015, 16, there's incredible numbers of entanglements, lots of dead whales. That precipitated the state to start to change the timing of the year when the fisheries occurs and the location of where these pots could be put to minimize the entanglements. And there's been great success with minimizing entanglements with humpbacks. It's also been a problem with leatherback turtles, and we've seen some tremendous sort of efforts on the part of the state of California to try and prevent impacts of the Dungeness crab fishery on leatherbacks and humpback whales for that matter. California Republic. A little known fact is that the leatherback turtle is the state marine reptile of California, and that was declared in 2013. So it's sort of officially on the radar. And actually, it's not the federal agency like NOAA that I work for that has minimized the declines from the Dungeness crab fishery, but it's been the state of California. because the Dungeness crab fishery is a state-run fishery, and we've seen incredible gains, and the state really, they talk to us on a monthly basis asking us where turtles are, where can they authorize these pots to be put, and it's been just a real great example of sort of cooperative research and management with researchers and state officials here in California. And they're just amazing animals. Giant pyrozoan being consumed by a leatherback turtle. So I'm going to move on now to the next species. And this is the loggerhead turtle. And loggerheads, as I said earlier, they're a little bit more of a sporadic visitor to California. They're pelagic. They generally stay in offshore waters. They will come into California, what we call the Southern California bite, that large sort of bite of the cookie south of Point Conception down to the US-Mexico border. And they'll come down into this region during warm years. Like with leatherbacks, we've done a lot of satellite telemetry with loggerhead turtles. We know that all the loggerheads that occur along the Pacific coast of North America originate from Japan. So you see this, what we call sort of a spaghetti plot here. These are, I don't know, about 400 or so satellite tracks of loggerhead turtles. Now, one of the things with this that's especially important is this sort of information about understanding where loggerheads go, why they go there, and when they go there can help us minimize impacts from marine fisheries and marine fisheries entanglements. So these are tracks of, and I'm going to let this roll for a second, but these are tracks of, I want to say about 10 or so loggerhead turtles. This is through satellite telemetry, and they're broken down by month, and each of those month periods are overlaid on the prevailing sea surface temperatures in the Pacific. And what you can see is that as seasons go throughout the course of a year, water temperatures change. And this thermocline, like the warm water goes up and down latitudinally as the season changes. And look how those loggerheads track that. So loggerheads are incredibly tied to sea surface temperature. They have a very narrow preferred temperature range in which they will forage and where they like to live. So if we know that, we're now equipped to kind of try and minimize fisheries impacts. And so what we've done, this is the National Marine Fisheries Service, my agency, is we've developed something called Turtle Watch. And it's a website. It's used for fishers. So a lot of these industrial fishing boats have internet on their boats. They can be thousands of miles from shore, and they're using their satellite internet. They can download a map, and they can see where the high probability loggerhead capture areas are on that day, and they can avoid those areas. So for example, they'd log in, they'd see that brown sort of amorphous blobbish of a polygon there and know that that is the preferred temperature range of loggerhead turtles. So let's not fish in that region right now, and they'll avoid those areas. And it's been very effective. So just another sort of great tool in our attempts to minimize impacts. Now let's focus on let's leave the Central Pacific and come to the coast of North America off Mexico and the US. Through work that I've done and my colleagues, we've identified that probably one of the most important areas for loggerheads is off the coast of Baja California. On the left, those are data generated through satellite telemetry, and on the right, that's from us flying in aircrafts trying to look for those turtles, just like we did with leatherbacks. And we found the hotspot, and this hotspot happens to be where this site is too frequent, or I should say was too frequent. Lots of dead turtles dying from impacts of getting caught in bottom set long lines and bottom set gill nets for halibut fish. And you'd see things like this. And 2012 was when the stuff really hit the fan, and over the course of just 1 month, about 500 turtles washed up ashore dead. And it's obviously very unsustainable. These turtle graveyards were up and down the coast in this one particular area of Baja. And that time, that precipitated out international attention. And Mexico, because of this, the pressure, both from the United States and elsewhere, they actually were extremely proactive, and they developed their own time area closure in that area to minimize impacts of loggerhead turtles. And it was an incredible success. The number of turtles stranding on the shores totally declined. Fishers were happy because the turtles were not getting caught in their gear. They were able to fish more efficiently. The problem, however, is that the longevity of this reserve is unknown, and we don't know how long this will be implemented. So we hope it's in perpetuity, but time will tell. Here's let's go to California waters now for loggerheads. It's a small, This is plate size, young juvenile turtle. There I am holding that turtle. It's a few years ago. This was during a period when we had this incredible marine heat wave. So from 2013 to 2016, both because of an El Nino and because of shifting of the phase of what's called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, where there's just, won't get too much into it, but there was a double whammy and waters got extremely warm. You may have heard of the blob off of Northern California, Oregon, and Washington, which was basically a dead zone in the oceans because it just got too warm. Well, in Southern California, it wasn't too warm, it became tropical. And lots of animals that you normally wouldn't see came into our waters. The wahoo and the pelagic red crabs, I'm kind of going clockwise here, and the bluefin tuna and pelagic yellow-bellied sea snakes and dorado and loggerheads and molas were all in our waters. It's like we were down off Baja or even farther south. And that doesn't occur very often, but it definitely was an amazing event at that time. And then starting in that, right when that sort of happened, is we were like, gosh, there's lots of loggerheads here. We need to get offshore and figure out what's going on. Recognizing that there's a marine fishery that could interact with these animals, time was short. We needed to figure out where these turtles were so that we could try and minimize impacts. And the fisheries were a big problem. And since then, and because of our work and because of just the agency's sort of precautionary approach, is the drift gillnet fishery and the longline fisheries, which were so prevalent, which were the reason for that dynamic closure that I talked about at the beginning of the California section, that little orange polygon at the bottom. Those fisheries essentially don't even happen in the US waters or California waters anymore. Instead, what we're now trying to use is something called a deep set buoy gear, which is this line that has just a couple of hooks on it that goes deep in the water that is supposed to be bycatch free. The lines are too thick and too rigid to entangle turtles or whales. And it's still in an experimental phase, but things seem very promising for this technique. And then on top of that, much like the Turtle Watch product I talked about, is that our US West Coast regional office, which is based in Long Beach, we've developed a similar tool. You can see the polygon on those two maps there. And we actually explain to fishers, okay, when is the closure in effect? When is it not in effect? What are the temperatures like? And this is all in an effort to try and minimize impacts of fisheries. I am a big fan of promoting commerce and keeping fishers on the water. It's the lifeblood of our country. We need to have fishers. And there's been too many disadvantages of our US fishers, and they're getting undercut by foreign fleets, and foreign prices are so low. You go to Costco or Walmart, none of those fish are from the US, those are from elsewhere. And that's putting our own fishermen out of a job. So any way that we can keep our own national citizens on the water, it's a win. And this sort of a tool, like the Turtle Watch, is an incredible win. And we just hope that these sort of tools can keep turtles safe and whales safe, but also keep our fishermen in business. And so I'll finish the talk, and I'm going to just focus on green turtles. And this is, again, well, for me, it's my favorite species. I've been studying green turtles for, I think, 29 years now. Did my graduate work on them in Baja, and so it's just that they're just the coolest. And I'll explain why as we go on here. But they're omnivores here in the Eastern Pacific. If you were to read a textbook from 20 years ago, it would talk about the fact that green turtles are the only exclusively herbivorous species of sea turtle worldwide. And that's because those textbooks were written based on green turtles, like in the Caribbean, where they eat nothing but seagrass, something called turtle grass there, which looks much like that eelgrass on the center left there. But in the Eastern Pacific, and probably because our waters are a little bit colder than elsewhere, and so they can't really digest plant material as well as in tropical zones, but they eat everything, anything that they can get their mouth on. This on the right here, it's eating a red algae in La Jolla Cove. Amazing photo, thanks to Ted Lilly for that. But they're just incredibly resilient, flexible. They can be found in all sorts of habitats, and I'll explain more. And I kind of think of the green turtle, they're really, they're the marine version of a cow. Although I said that they eat all sorts of stuff, they still do depend a lot on those herbivorous foods. And in some senses, it's like a lawnmower with flippers. It's a photo I made for when my children were in like second grade, and this this image just stuck with me. It's something I gave in the classroom lecture, and I still think it's pretty cool, so I just keep it in here. But it makes sense, and one of the things to point out is that green turtles maintain what are called grazing pastures. Now, this is a photo in the Caribbean, but it's just too cool not to explain, is that green turtles through the millennia, they've come to know that new growth of seagrass has a lot less cellulose and a lot more nutrients, and is a lot more easy to digest. And so they maintain these pastures. They are like lawnmowers, and they keep these certain areas. So on the right there is the pasture that they're grazing pasture. On the left is the old seagrass that has like epibionts and small animals and just a lot of cellulose, difficult to digest. And so they've behaviorally been able to modify their habitat to increase their digestive efficiency. And of all sea turtles, it's the only example we know of where they engineer their habitats to increase their feeding efficiency. They also, in terms of physiology, and morphologies, they have this incredibly long gastrointestinal tract. An animal that's 100 pounds will have a digestive tract that's on the order of about 35 feet long. They have a very long retention time in their gut, so they're able to suck out every last nutrient before they excrete their feces and things into the water. Again, you can see on the left there that just like incisiform like beak, it's a pair of scissors, and they're able to crop those foods very close to the seafloor. In San Diego Bay, the box there, that's the real hot spot of where green turtles occur. It's no surprise that it's in areas where the seagrass habitats are. Through some of the work we've done, though, is what we've learned is that it's not the seagrass per se that they are consuming, although it makes them about half their diet. But they eat all the small animals and everything that's associated with those seagrass pastures. So it's an ecosystem that provides host for their foods, but it's also food itself, speaking of the seagrass. So the work that we do, we capture sea turtles in San Diego Bay. We use large entanglement nets to bring these turtles in. We work them up on the back of this animal. You can see kind of a little bit what's left of a satellite tag on that white patch right there. But these are incredibly large animals. They take a lot of people power to get them into our boat. Our work historically was done during the daytime. These days, things are at night as much as during the day. Some folks might remember the South Bay power plant, the Duke Energy power plant that was decommissioned in 2011. And since then, the region has totally flipped in terms of when turtles occur in certain spots. And it's sort of dictated that we do our work at night because that's when they come in from offshore waters to rest in like really shallow water while they're sleeping. So when we do capture a turtle, just a great headshot. We sort of collect every piece of information we can. We collect tissue samples, blood samples. We can, from their hormones, we can tell what species it is. We can tell their health. We do genetic analysis to determine nesting beach origin, weight, body condition. We put satellite tags or cameras on these animals to track their movements. We know that it's just such an investment time-wise and finances-wise to catch these animals that we just maximize this opportunity in every sense. So these turtles get essentially the full workup. And it's also important to note too that somebody that's been deeply involved with the Humane Society for the last couple of years, Andrew Kushner, is somebody that's been collaborating with us, and we're going to start doing some really tried and true veterinary health assessments this coming year. We've done similar things in the past, but to have somebody that formerly with the Humane Society helping with us, it's just a great example of teamwork between two organizations to help benefit sea turtles in our local waters. This is the largest turtle in San Diego Bay. You can see here, this is with my friend Lauren. This is back in the day when the power plant was there, so it gives a little bit of a timeline on it. You can see the power plant in the back. This turtle was affectionately known as Wrinklebutt. You can look at the back of her shell there. It seems to be a little bit distorted, and that's whether that was as a hatching or what, we don't know. But it's still probably the most famous turtle. I think the Unified Port of San Diego still has a website or a web page dedicated to this individual turtle, so kind of a neat story. We talked about the satellite telemetry where we put tags on the backs of the turtles to track their movements. this has helped us realize that green turtles in San Diego Bay are coming from at least 2 different nesting areas, probably 3. So the one nesting site, and I kind of lump them together, is the Revillagigedos Islands. So Clarion Island and Socorro Island, turtles have nested on each of those. Turtles from San Diego Bay also nest in the Tres Marias, which is just north of Puerto Vallarta. And then, although we don't have the trek all the way to it, but that Michoacan site there on the lower right, that's sort of the stronghold of nesting for green turtles in the Eastern Pacific. And it looks like one of our turtles was on its way there when the battery or the conked out or the tag fell off. So when we talk about success stories, green turtles in the Eastern Pacific are probably one of the best. I don't know if you all may also have sort of the image of like people's faces and stuff covering up the rightmost bars on that graph, 2015 and such. I do. I can't see the upper half of those bars, but I will tell you that those bars go extremely high. And it shows like these populations, they were tanked in the early 1980s, and through nesting beach conservation and through minimizing fisheries bycatch, little by little the population grew. And right now we're in an exponential growth phase where this population is really recovering. It's very pleasing to me. I mean, consider in 1992 is when I started studying these green turtles, this very population. Look at how low the population was then to where we are today. So it's been a total paradigm shift in my career. It's delightful to be able to share that story. With that increase in population size, as we see turtles popping up in places that we hadn't seen them before. And before I get there, this is an example, like on an average night of nesting now, that's what the beach looks like. There's virtually like no spot on the sand. This is in Michoacan that is untouched by a turtle track. So just a cool example of just the sheer abundance of nesting animals. So again, they're popping up in places like Jolla Cove that they had not necessarily been before. And for the last 3 years, we've been doing a citizen science project there where we engage with local community members that are avid divers and snorkelers to collect photos. We get the photos from them. We put the photos through a facial recognition software. We're able to identify individual turtles. And then we look at the timestamps of the photos and we can tell when and how long these turtles have been there. I can tell you that as we speak, there's probably 7 or 8 turtles in La Jolla Cove. If you guys are interested in seeing these animals, reach me offline. I don't know if my email is available. Perhaps Carly can share that. I will say one last little nifty thing with these animals is it's much like Hawaiian turtles. They're habituated to people. They do not swim away. You can come right up to them and look at them. They'll come and look at you and just have a curiosity that's uncommon with sea turtles. And this is just because La Jolla Cove has been an area that's been frequented by a variety of marine stakeholders for many, many years. But it's really been only in the last 5 or 6 years that we've heard of reports of green turtles in that area. So a neat example. And then we run what's called a sighting hotline for people that see green turtles or other species in Southern California. And we're getting reports of green turtles all over the place. And just last week, like for example, we got something of a turtle seen in a small drainage in Irvine, California, about 5 miles from the coast. And so turtles, they just poke around and find their way into nooks and crannies of marine tributaries all over Southern California. It's just really neat to see these animals and hear stories. And if anybody has ever seen a turtle in the wild, you remember it. Whether it was on a nesting beach or in Hawaii, you remember that. It's that incredible intimate connection between humans and turtles that is something that captivated me early on, has kept me going in my career. So obviously, with so many turtles in industrialized areas, there's big problems in terms of impacts. Despite the fact that the populations are climbing, we still are dealing with a lot of dead turtles, a lot of dead green turtles in Southern California each year, each month. Boat strikes tend to be the biggest problem, particularly in San Diego Bay. That's a pretty unsightly photo, but it's just sort of a picture is worth 1,000 words, so I thought I'd share it. And so how do we deal with that? Well, we're trying our best to get signs up to let people know the turtles are there, to slow down. And going slow is sort of the best first way that we would minimize those impacts. And so to close, I'll just say that California is a place that's important for turtles that come from around the Pacific, whether it's Japan with the Loggerheads or Indonesian Solomon Islands for the leatherbacks, or Mexico for the green turtles. it's just a really great place. And it's a place that very few people know the turtles occur there. So with that, I hope I've kind of given you a new perspective on our own backyard. Maybe you'll get into La Jolla Cove, or if folks are interested, again, reach out to me and we can find out ways to get you to observe our turtle work in San Diego Bay once we get back on the water. That's something that we offer all the time and people take us up on that. So please don't be shy. And with that, I'll say thanks.
Oh my gosh, this was such an amazing presentation. Now I'm even more inspired for us to go do a beach cleanup in next month for this Wake Up with Wildlife. So
good. I'm glad.
That was so great. We do have a few questions, and you did kind of touch on it, but what someone was particularly curious on when is a good time to see the sea turtles in La Jolla.
I see that. Okay. Year round. No, you cannot see them from the shore. Unfortunately, you do have to get on the water. I'd say, so that limits things. But for the snorkelers out there, if you're interested in seeing those turtles, the landmarks that I can share are that at the Marine Room, which is a restaurant, which hopefully will be open when we get back here, but right next to the Marine Room, there is a beach access, little sort of walkway that goes down to the sea. And it brings you down to a beach. At high tide, that walkway has waves crashing at the bottom of it, so I wouldn't recommend it. But at low tide, any given day, go down to the beach, get in the water, and turn left. And about 200 yards from where you get in the water, you'll see your first rock outcrops very close to the shore. And if you spend any period of time there, you'll see turtles. And just kind of swim in that area, and you'll probably see other snorkelers out there doing the same thing. And if you bring your head above water, you'll probably hear somebody say, hey, over here, because they're all looking at turtles. So it's it's an incredible spot to go. For me, literally every time I've been out there, it's been like 6 or 7 times, I've seen turtles. I've had dear friends that have visited from places like Utah that said, you're absolutely full of it, Seminoff. I don't believe you. I brought him out there, my friend Joel, for example, and he's like, oh my God. I just saw my first turtle in my life. So La Jolla Cove is a pretty neat spot, pretty special.
That's awesome. We have someone else asking if you've noticed a change in abundance of males versus females here in San Diego due to water temperature change.
Yes, we have. So my predecessor, the famous Dr. Peter Dutton, who sort of is the person that founded a lot of the work in San Diego Bay. Actually, let me stop and one person needs props. And that person is Margie Stinson, who is a professor at Southwestern College in Chula Vista. And Margie actually was the first person that ever did any sea turtle work in San Diego. She was like the grandmother of sea turtle ecology. And actually, as early as 1976, she first photographed wrinkle butt in the water. And that photo I showed you was 2008, I think. And so 76 to 2008, same turtle. But back to our work is that, yes, in Peter's early days, so I want to say like the mid-90s, so I started in 2002, but in the mid-90s, they'd see a great number of adult males. And these days, we might see 1 or 2 a year, very infrequently. Is it too few to maintain the population? We don't know that yet, but certainly it's trending in a very alarming direction. And that's something probably happening elsewhere in the world, as my colleagues have pointed out and as I mentioned earlier.
Wow, that's amazing. We have one more question that is asking, are there any food or product labels that claim that food is responsibly sourced or like sea turtle safe? Is there anything that we should be looking for when buying products to make sure that we're supporting, that we're not supporting anything that's hurting wildlife sea turtle populations?
Sure. So I would, that's a fantastic question. That's a great entree. And let me just elaborate on that a little bit, is that the one thing we have control over, we can't control fishers, we can't control what's happening at sea, but as consumers, we can control what we buy. And that consumer buying power is something that if we get a collective mass, we can really change fishing behavior and human behavior in general. And one of the greatest tools that I found, this is not just for sea turtles, but there is something called the what is it? The Seafood Guide out of Monterey Bay Aquarium, and look up the seafood. Go to their website. They'll send you a bunch of little like wallet-sized foldable pieces, and that is updated, I believe, a couple times a year. And on that little piece of paper, it kind of color codes, and it has all the species that you would generally see at a seafood store, seafood market, and it color codes those and says what's responsible to eat and what's not responsible to eat. And those things change as time goes on. And so, for example, people may have heard of Chilean sea bass back in the day. That was something that was really popular. Well, it was really popular because it was new. It was a new product, but it turns out that that was a very irresponsible. It's very irresponsibly caught and had huge bycatch. So for sea turtles specifically, the things that I would be concerned about, number one, is with shrimp. You know, some people, I have many colleagues that will say don't eat shrimp at all, and I understand that, because shrimp, as these nets are dragging the sea floor, they're catching all sorts of stuff, including sea turtles. Or if you're buying shrimp from Costco, those are tiger shrimp. They're raised in shrimp farms in Indonesia that they've stripped away mangrove and had huge mangrove deforestation to help a lot of those shrimp. I've had those shrimp before, so I'm not trying to be preachy here. I'm just trying to state facts, and even I slip up sometimes. But one of the things with shrimp is that there's a technological fish, something called a turtle excluder device, which is this apparatus that goes in the back of nets for wild-caught shrimp, and it ejects large animals like rays and turtles out of the net so that it really focuses on just the target species. And there are a number of places, like in the US, number of restaurants that they only source turtle-safe shrimp. And so any restaurateur or any fishmonger that is supplying shrimp, they will know whether those shrimp are caught with TED devices or not. So a place that's worth its weight will know where their fish product came from, and it's just simply asking questions. And if they don't know the answer, then you maybe move on to something else on the menu. And then the last thing I'll mention is that there is sort of this global effort to do what's called green labeling of products. And there is an organization called the Marine Stewardship Council, for example, that they do what's called eco-labeling, where they will actually they will do like sneak visits, like sneak inspections to areas to see if shrimp trawlers are using TEDs, or they'll make sure that fishers are fishing responsibly. And there are a number of eco-labeled fish products out there, and that's not in my wheelhouse. I can't tell you the specifics, but that's the entity that's out there. And I'd say look up Marine Stewardship Council, and you can see some of those responsible products to consume.
Oh, awesome. That's great to know. We have another question is, how does the ocean pollution in Imperial Beach affect the sea turtles, the water itself, and or its food sources? You guys notice anything from that?
So Imperial Beach per se, you know, with the slough there, and there's a lot of times there's sewage discharge, that can be a big problem. It actually does what's called nitrogen load the system, so it can actually provide too much nutrients, and you get something called eutrophication, which happens. Not so much in San Diego Bay, because the only sort of water outlet that goes into San Diego Bay that arguably comes from that IB area is the Otay River. And these days it's almost a trickle, so it's not much. But certainly marine pollution is a big problem, and just to take that as a launching point, like plastics and microplastics, you know, that's a huge problem. It's a sort of a buzz term. It's a little bit, these days it's sort of, it's catchy and in vogue to talk about microplastics, but it's true. We don't know the acute health impacts of integration of microplastics into our own body systems. We suspect that there's what's called immunosuppression that could happen. How that plays out in terms of sea turtle health, there's people working on that, but I think we're still sort of early in our understanding, and we'll learn more certainly. But I will say, you know, things like the ocean cleanup, that, you know, lofty goal of putting a boom out in the Central Pacific to collect trash at the sea surface in places like the Great Garbage Patch. I've worked directly with the ocean cleanup. They're out of Europe. It seems like maybe it's so far-fetched, how are we going to make a difference? But you got to start somewhere. And so that boom system that they developed to collect plastics, they finished their second prototype. It was very successful. You know, if it ramps up, if there's funds to do that, who knows? But marine plastics and marine pollution, I would say, next to fisheries, is is probably one of the biggest problems for conservation, not just for turtles, but for any marine species, period, large or small.
Oh, that's, yeah, I definitely feel like we'll be doing that next month. And then our last question is, what happens to the turtles if their nesting beach is gone? Do they search for another location, like the example you were showing for the Hawaiian atolls?
Yes. Okay, so East Island, for example, there is another nesting beach nearby called Turn Island that we've seen an uptick of nesting there. Turtles, and one thing I had not mentioned earlier is, but they have, when your nesting beach disappears, it's a problem. And it's a problem because turtles have what's called nest site fidelity. So as that hatchling is developing in the egg, they have small magnetite crystals that orient in their brain, literally, that creates a compass. So that very same beach which they emerge from as a hatchling, 25 years later when they're an adult, they go back to that same beach. They might have traversed 20,000 miles in the ocean, but they go back to the same beach they came from. And so when that beach is gone, it's almost like, does not compute, where do I go? And that, in those cases, it's a couple of things have been documented. One is that the females will either resorb their eggs and just forego reproduction. We've also seen, and this is sort of a sad example, of some females where they will just lay their eggs in the bottom of the ocean. We've seen collections of eggs that have been counted, which is just so tragic. But we hope, and the resilience of turtles suggests that this will happen, is that those individuals, if they survive, they'll figure it out. And whether, whether they have to move 10 miles or 100 miles to find another spot, they will probably search and seek and find some sort of habitat. Whether it's as ideal as what their original nesting beach was or not remains unknown, but they probably eventually will find a spot. However, if, let's say the Central Pacific, for example, let's say all the beaches disappeared in northwestern Hawaiian Islands, then it's, I don't know where they could find a spot because there are no more spots. When I say find a spot, that's assuming there's something fairly adjacent to what was lost. So, sea level rise is a huge problem, and we haven't seen the last of it, that's for sure.
Oh, that's what makes you think, for sure. I will definitely include your email address in our follow-up that we send to all the attendees. But if no one else has any other questions, I hope everyone enjoyed this presentation. I know I did thoroughly. I was so enthralled. I want to go do research now and join your guys' team. Great. I'm so happy that Dr. Kushner put us in touch with each other. It was such an amazing presentation. Thank you so much for taking your time this morning. We're getting a ton of people saying thank you, and that it was amazing. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
For taking your time this morning.
Yeah, I sure appreciate it. Excellent questions. And I do honestly reach out to me. I'm a very good communicator, and I can help you find turtles and help you get involved if that's something you want to do. So really appreciate it today. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Thanks everyone for joining us. Have a good day, guys.
Bye-bye.